all of life should be lived in the view of eternity. That is, it is the grid by which we operate because we have one life to live, and that one life affects directly our eternal being and destination. And so we pay attention very closely to what we do in view of eternity. One writer put it this way: every action of your life touches on some chord that will vibrate in eternity. Every action of your life touches on some chord that will vibrate in eternity. That is, what we do here affects there. So all of life is important, our decisions are important, but I think something that many of us have probably heard from a young age is that there are two decisions that really are going to impact eternity. The first one is, what will you do with Jesus? That's the most obvious one that's going to have a direct impact on eternity. To reject Jesus is to reject the offer of salvation. It will directly and in a negative way impact our eternity. But second behind that, close to that, is, who am I going to marry? Because I believe that the answer to that question also has direct impact and links to the questions of eternity. I don't have to tell you, especially in this room full of people who are, on the whole, most of us are married. I think it's impossible to know how much influence your spouse asserts with you or carries with you until you are actually living together in marriage. Certainly you influence each other, certainly you help each other, but when you're married, you start to see just how strong that influence and that impact becomes. And thus it begins to really, really matter who we marry. And our inability sometimes to communicate that, because I don't know that you can communicate it. I mean, how do you really find the words to describe the pull of a spouse on the other? I haven't figured it out yet. But it's something that we have to take very seriously. And regardless of what a great deal of society is saying, human beings are drawn toward marriage relationships. Okay? You hear a famous celebrity or someone that comes out and they've been caught in an infidelity or something along those lines, and they'll say something like this: well, monogamy, marriage, it's outdated, it's not natural. If it is not natural, if it is outdated, then why do you keep why are you a serial marrier? Why is it that you marry and then you get out of that relationship and then you marry again and you get out of that relationship and you marry again? If you're not drawn to it, if it doesn't matter, then why do you do it? And you can't say it's a societal construct, because that won't hold water. If it is a societal construct, then why is it universal? And why is it that people who have no place for God in their worldview, they're still drawn to it? There has to be a higher and a stronger explanation for what is given. And so then you can see that it truly does matter who we marry and who they are. As a matter of fact, our culture is obsessed with it. To the degree that they say they're not is actually to the degree that they are obsessed with it. Love is based upon a feeling. So marriage vows, whereas traditional marriage vows have always been till death do us part, now marriage vows are being transformed to say, so long as our love shall last. I'm going to be the first person to tell you, just go ahead and get this on the board. I will not perform a ceremony that has those words in it. Because what you're doing on the front end is saying something about the relationship that I can't agree with. What you're saying is, as long as our love is last, if it runs its course, it runs its course. That's not what the Bible says. That doesn't even resemble what the Bible says. it gives that notion that love is a feeling, and then that feeling should drive you then to do things for other people. Whereas the Bible says directly the opposite. When we will do things for people, what love really is, love is a verb. What we do, it will then produce the feelings. And we've got that backwards. And so it creates issues along those lines. So this morning, I want us to think about marrying in light of eternity. Okay? Now, before we launch into this, there are a few caveats I want to throw in here because, well, some people, sometimes we struggle with understanding that there are general concepts and you're not speaking to every single situation on the planet. So let me offer a few caveats. It does not mean a person can live a fulfilled and faithful life to God and never be married. There is no rule that says you must be married. As a matter of fact, if you study church history, the early church prized celibacy and singleness far more than they did marriage. They thought that was a higher a benchmark of spirituality. Whereas in our culture, we're obsessed with getting people married. If we have a single person here past 19, we want to try and find them somebody to date. Hey, they've got time. Leave them alone. We're not the marriage, we're not eHarmony, okay? Let people go. We can live a fulfilled life. As a matter of fact, I would argue that we need to figure out and learn and create an identity of our own and understand our own worth and value before we enter into a relationship with a person who is going to directly affect that. So that's the first thing. Let's stop playing matchmaker. There's nothing wrong with living a single life. The second thing would be this. It is not a sin, from what I can see in the New Testament, it is not a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. I don't see that anywhere. Now, I know there are texts that are often people try and take and apply. For an example, 2 Corinthians 6, don't be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever. The only problem is he's not talking about marriage. He's talking about a church and its infiltration of false teachers and allowing those false teachers to hold sway over a local congregation. That's got nothing to do with marriage. So how can you take that text and use it? And then certain laws under the Old Testament and where God forbid them from intermarrying with other nations. Well, we need to go back and study that passage a little more closely about why he had that, and then pay attention to the fact that there were exceptions to that rule. Think about in the genealogy of Jesus, there are 4 women in it. And you can make an argument that 3 of them in particular were Gentile. Okay? It is not a sin for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. Further, as we think about just 1 or 2 more caveats, and that is that what we're going to talk about in this particular study is generally true, okay? Is it true that you can find 2 people who are Christians, 2 people who claim to be Christian, and their marriage be awful? Yes. Can you find 2 people who claim to be Christians and their marriage suffer infidelity? Yes. I'm not saying that this is a 100% hard and fast rule. What we're saying is, generally speaking, when both individuals are faithful in their commitment to Christ, their marriages tend to be more thriving, more fulfilling, and more fruitful. And that's not something that a Christian did a survey on. That's something that is seen by secular people who are doing surveys and who are doing the research. Okay? So please, I'm asking for indulgence here because I understand everybody says, well, I've got a situation. I know a person who did this and it worked out fine. Listen, I know that. But I can also tell you this. For every one you can show me that worked out great, I can show you 20 that didn't. So if we're going to play a numbers game, that's a losing battle. Okay? And so what we're coming to is trying to come at this not from an attacking standpoint, but simply to see what the Bible is saying and to lay out some things. And so what I want us to do, and where we'll spend most of our time this morning, is just simply talking about three principles. That if you have two people who are marrying one another, and they will live and they believe and are convicted of these principles, it begins to get marriage off in the right direction. Okay? Is there any married person that would say that marriage is easy? That's been married more than a year? No. Okay? That's one of the first things we have to, when we start talking about marriage, and look, fairy tales, read them to your kids all you want to. But happily ever after isn't so easy. It's not easy. And what many people think is marriage is just going to be magical. It's going to change everything. I had a teacher in school who would always say to us, he said, "You know what marriage will do for you? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. It just means you've got two people who are very different with different backgrounds and different upbringings and different thoughts about how things should be operated, down to how clothes should be folded, and puts them together and forces them to figure out how to operate on every single level of life. It's not magic. It's work." So, let's begin by looking at these three principles. And of course, these come from Genesis chapter 2, but we're going to spend our time in Matthew 19. Jesus is actually questioned about divorce in the context, which is interesting because many times we misread that context, but there is a foundation in marriage that has to be accepted and understood. So let's look at Matthew 19, beginning in verse 3. It says, "The Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?'" Now, this is a question they don't really care about the answer. What they think they're doing is creating a no-win situation for Jesus, because there were two rabbis that lived right before Jesus was born, maybe had been alive right as he was born. But they were the two most influential rabbis of the time. You have Hillel and Shammai. Okay? And they were on opposite ends of the spectrum. And this question is really coming from Deuteronomy chapter 24. Which, understanding what the law said, that if you find some uncleanness in your spouse, and debate was, what does the Bible mean by the uncleanness that you find in your spouse? Okay? And so, the more liberal rabbi, which actually, by the way, I think based on the context, the apostles agreed with the more liberal rabbi, was that for any reason, basically, you could get divorced. The more conservative approach simply said no, that fornication was the only reason you could get divorced. Now again, they're not asking this question because they really care what Jesus thinks about marriage and divorce. They're asking it because no matter how Jesus answers it, you know what he's done? He split his base. That's the way they're thinking about it in political terms. You split the base. You've got this large group of people who are following you, some on the right and some on the left. I'm going to ask you a question, I'll split your base in two. But Jesus answers masterfully. And he says this, he answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.'" That is a quotation from Genesis 2:18 to 25. All right, so here are the basics of the foundation. Number one, two of them. An understanding that marriage is ordained and created by God. Notice in this text how many times Jesus refers to this. It says, "He who created them." Well, then that led him to create marriage between them. And he said, that's God speaking authoritatively, And then he says in verse 6, and what God has joined together. This is a God-ordained institution. It's not, as we said earlier, a social construct. Okay? For an example, people will often say something like this. You can see it if you pay attention to what you're watching on TV. You can hear these attitudes come out. And you might hear, I heard another influential celebrity say even recently, why do I need a piece of paper to know I love somebody? And people, what amazes me, and people sit back and they go, wow, what an argument. And I'm like, yeah, wow, what an argument, but not for the reason you think it is. That's an awful statement. When I see a couple who is contemplating going through divorce, and then they enter into, and they say something like this to someone else, look, we'll always be family. We don't need the piece of paper to say that we're family. That is the first clue in my mind that we are off the radar. Marriage is not a piece of paper that the court issues you. People say, what difference does that make? It makes every difference in the world. One says that it's just a piece of paper that says we are married. Therefore, what can you do with it? You can pick it up and you can tear it up anytime you want to. If, however, I believe what the New Testament says, that marriage is when God joins a man and a woman together, and what God has joined together, do not let man separate or put asunder to drive a wedge between. And so if you've got two people, for an example, notorious study. How do people typically drive rental cars? In the words of Jeff Foxworthy, it could be a 90-year-old person, and that's a Ford Fiesta that's about to see more air than a skateboard at the X Games. They're just going to fly in that thing. Why? They got insurance. What difference does it make? It ain't mine. I don't have to live with it. But for some reason, they won't do that to theirs. Because how you view something determines how you treat it. And so the very first thing, that if both individuals can come into marriage realizing that this is something ordained by God, this is higher than us, it's stronger than us, and it's something that God does, then we're getting in the right direction because we're both entering into it with a seriousness, and that this is not dating. This is not dating, where you can drop a person yesterday and get a new one tomorrow. That's not how marriage works. That may be how people treat it. It's not how it works. Number two, the second principle is this of the foundation. There are particulars in marriage that have to be upheld. It is one man and one woman. God joins them together. They are to separate from their families and to be joined together. Okay? Which means his parents nor her parents have a place in your marriage. What God has joined together, man will leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife. Unless there are extreme circumstances. This marriage is already full. It's got a husband and a wife. It doesn't need 4 in-laws in it. People say, I don't like that. Listen, I didn't write it. And one of the reasons why it doesn't need 4 additional people in it is because it's hard enough with 2 people. When 2 people are married, sometimes we do a disservice and we say to people, when are you going to start a family? Well, the second that you are married, you are a family. Mom and dad no longer make decisions that dictate what husband and wife do. Nor do mom and dad need to know about every disagreement that we have as a husband and wife, because like it or not, no parent can be impartial to their child. They're always going to side with their child. They cannot be impartial. Like it or not, that's the truth. But further, a man and a woman leave their father and mother, and they are joined together, and they are joined together for life. I understand Jesus will give an exception in a moment. Pay attention to what he's saying, though. That's not the intention for marriage. Don't you find it interesting? Jesus asked them a question about divorce, and he doesn't really answer them. He simply says this: in the beginning, God created one man and one woman, and he joined them together and said they should be together for the rest of their life. That's his answer. That's his answer. Are there certain extenuating circumstances? Yes. But you asked me about God's original intent, and I'm giving you the answer of God's original intent. That is believing. Listen, if we're operating under the principle that we can just get out whenever we want to just because we decide, by the way, somebody comes in and says, I just don't love you anymore. No. And I know that this is what I'm saying is not popular, and some people are looking at me kind of sideways. But we need to hear this. If a husband or a wife comes along and says, I just don't love him anymore, I just don't love her anymore, the first question that I'm going to ask that person is, why do you think it's okay for you to disobey God and to forsake the vow that you took? God said that a husband and wife should do what? He commanded them to love each other. People say, well, what if it's something else involved? That's not what they said. They said, I just don't love them anymore. That's the worldly idea. My feelings are gone. Well, look, your feelings will come and go. Marriage is a commitment before God. We don't quit our jobs for that. I just don't like it there anymore, so I'm just going to quit, and that's it. So, if we can understand that and we view that, because if I have this mentality that says, okay, if we can't get along, then we'll just get out, what are you going to do? You'll find a reason to get out. But if you look at this and say, God joined this together, and therefore, just because we're going through a difficult time, that doesn't mean I can get out. It means I've got to get underneath it and get to work. So that's the first area, that when 2 people come together and they realize that divorce is not a word that we are using in our marriage. We just don't use that word. We don't threaten each other with it. We don't talk about it. We're not going into this looking and expecting it to fail. We're going into it which says, I'm going to work with everything that I am to make sure that it thrives. Now look, if you've got two people who are going into marriage and one of them believes, no, this is absolutely everything God said it be for life, and the other person says, you know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that's going to be problematic. We're operating on different foundations. The second thing is that we have to understand who the ruler is in marriage. From our text in Matthew 19, it was something that God created. It was something that God joined together. God is the one who sets and dictates what marriage is supposed to be. This is God ordained, not man ordained. So, who will dictate what is acceptable and unacceptable in marriage? God will. God will. If He created it for us and for our good, then why doesn't He have control over it? Is there really any area in life, if Jesus truly is Lord of all, then why is it that so many people want to say Jesus is Lord of all except my relationship? Well, then He's not Lord of all. He will teach us how to be married, okay? He will correct us. He will lead us. He will teach us about humility and asking and seeking forgiveness and granting forgiveness and loving one another through difficulties. I'm going to tell you, one of the greatest tragedies that I see so often in ministry is people who get divorced and they are on the brink of having an exceptional relationship with each other. If they would just work through this one issue and get to the other side, they would realize. You see, in every relationship, it's not just in marriage relationship, you have the kind of romantic side where everything is great. You know, there's no way I could ever not love you and want to be around you 24/7. And then the conflict comes along. Well, you're not who I thought I was marrying. Oh, come on. He was. He was looking right at you the whole time. You just didn't want to see it. He's exactly who he's always been. She's exactly who she's always been. So now there's conflict, and we say, well, I guess that just means we're not compatible. No. Conflict. Then comes resolution, and then comes intimacy. Conflict, resolution, intimacy. That is the order. You will have a conflict, you will work through it together, and it draws you closer together, and you love and appreciate one another for being willing to forgive and to humble yourselves before one another, and to know that marriage is not me against you. It's been rightly compared that when one spouse wants to look at the other and say, everything is your fault, it's like two people being in a boat in the middle of the ocean saying, your side of the boat is sinking. Well, I don't know if you noticed this, we're both in this boat. So many people, they end their marriage at conflict. When if they would just push through, they would experience marriage the way God wanted them to. They would experience, and by the way, how can we say we're gospel people if we run from conflict? How can we say we're Jesus people if the first time a conflict arises, we just run away? I'm sure glad God didn't do that to us. He came down in flesh and got down on our level. It's one of the reasons why we love Him so much. Because you have conflict, you have resolution, and that creates intimacy. But the third area is this, and that has to do with the direction of our lives. So if we can come together and realize that there is a foundation, that God has ordained it, God rules it, there's also this importance of our direction. Two people who are heading in the same direction. Now, when the world talks about how two people should grow closer together in marriage, they do it like this. Let's say this is the husband and this is the wife. And so what you're going to do is you're going to continue to grow and take steps toward each other, and you're going to learn to connect, and you just get closer and closer and closer and closer. Christian marriage is quite different than that. Let me explain what I mean. Christian marriage understands that it's not just a husband here and a wife here, there's a God up here. And so there's this crazy thing that happens. What if husband and wife were concerned with getting closer to God? Remember, God is sitting up here, husband here, wife here. If husband and wife are on this journey to get closer to God, what do they start doing the closer they get to God? They're getting closer to each other. This way, it's all us. This way, we're getting closer to God and each other at the same time. When you go to a marriage ceremony, when I perform them, I describe this to the people who are listening, that before this couple will partake in their vows, the vows that they will take to one another are horizontal vows. Before they enter into horizontal vows, they will first enter into vertical vows. You know this part, do you take this woman, do you take this man, on and on and on we go, before God? Yes. So before you ever promise your spouse to love them, you promise God to love them first. And with that true north, then you pledge your love to your spouse horizontally. People think church things, they're what? They take our time away from each other. We don't have the time to spend with each other. No. When you've got two people who, as Paul would say of the Philippian church in Philippians 1:27, who will strive side by side together for the faith of the gospel. It's a whole new level of love and adoration. Now look, we're not as far as I wanted to get this morning, but that'll be all right too. I realize some of the things I've said are not popular. I realize that some of you may not even care for them. That's okay too. But do you see, I think we can admit a few things on the front end. Number one, marriage is going to have its challenges. I think we can all admit that. And so every advantage that we can give to a young couple entering into marriage, or an older couple, whoever they may be, every advantage we can give to that couple, we should do our best to give them every advantage. Well, if both people entering into that have the advantage of believing that God created marriage. We are in this for a lifetime. God will rule our marriage, not other people, not our family, but God. And that together we will live our lives running after God. Not me running after God and you running after something else. Not him running after God and her running after something else. Do you see what that does? If you run after God and your spouse runs somewhere else, which way are you going? Opposite. But if both of us are running together, our marriage is headed in a direction. And it's got a much better chance than others. This is what marrying toward eternity means. In this room, in this gathering of Christians, I'm assuming that as Christians, we have it as our main goal to glorify God, to enjoy Him forever, and to live with Him forever. I'm assuming that amongst us as Christians. And if that is our goal, it would seem like we would want somebody to walk with us in our closest earthly relationship toward the same goal. So we marry toward eternity. We do everything toward eternity. Our lives are short. They're very short. I know this study has been about marriage, but take it anywhere. Look at your life right now in view of eternity. Do you like the song it's playing? Remember, everything we do will strum a chord that will echo and vibrate through eternity. Do you like the song it's playing? If not, Jesus has come to us in our conflict. Never become a Christian. He's come to us in that conflict. He has resolved that conflict. Through the cross, He took the punishment that we bore, that if we receive Him through a penitent faith that confesses Him as the Son of God to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins, that conflict is resolved, and that creates a wonderful, loving relationship of intimacy with Him. Or as a Christian, I've been walking with God for a long time. There's been a conflict. I go to Him, seek His forgiveness. He grants it. And there's intimacy yet again. That's how it works. If we can help you do that this morning, we want to, as we stand and sing this song.